Okay, welcome. This, I think, part number 4 that we're doing on American law and Jewish law. The Talmud and American law actually is what it's called. You know, we've talked about capital punishment, the morality of war, and a few other things. Tonight I wanted to talk, really the topic is about the economy. Because that's something that affects everybody, regardless of what your position is on a war, regardless of what your position is on any given subject. The economy is going to have a direct effect on everybody living within society. Now, the economy was a really long, big topic, and it was hard to really narrow it down because what do you talk about in the economy? I mean, the money supply, I don't know much about. I mean, then you need a chairman of the Fed to come in here and tell you about that situation. So I thought that we would focus in on some of the things that the Torah does talk about. You know, when it talks about the economy, and especially in Israel, when the Jews actually entered the land of Israel, they established a government, and what kind of an economy was run at that time. And in the economy itself, even a little bit, even more focused, is we're going to talk about acquisitions and ownership. How did the Torah look at property being owned and acquired? And I thought that would be interesting because in some ways, of course, it's the same as America, and in some ways it's a little bit different. Okay? Let's start by just talking about property ownership. Okay? Judaism in general, I mean with some exceptions, as we'll see later on, was generally what we would call basically a capitalistic society. Meaning it allowed for private property, it allowed for people to start businesses, it allowed for people to make a profit, it basically let the economy run. Although there were restrictions upon how much you can charge for certain items, so even within this free economy, there were certain restrictions that the government or the king or the Sanhedrin put on. You couldn't be a vulture. You know, you couldn't gouge, for example. I mean, even if you're the only guy in town that had wheat and you could charge an enormous amount, still the Sanhedrin put a lid upon the amount of profit that you can have. But with small restrictions and very few in between, generally in Israel was a kind of a system where you can grow to be rich. And within that milieu, you can have what is called private property. Now, we know that even in our days, there were societies and there were systems of government that didn't allow you to have that. That everything belonged to the government, of the government, by the government, or the state, or whatever you called it, and that's the way it was, and you couldn't, and something couldn't belong to you. And in some sense, it's okay, because in theory, that if we all owned everything, and everything belongs to God, and everything is His, then it makes sense to take everything, put it in one big pot, and then split it up a little bit over. Everybody gets a little bit, and that's the way it works. So, but that's not the way it worked in Judaism. It's clear from the Torah that you may prosper, you may grow to be as rich as you can possibly get to be, and you can certainly own private property. Okay, so now we're going to talk about how does one acquire within Judaism property. Now, property is generally, we talk about two separate ideas. One is movable property. What would be an example of movable property? Thank you very much. A sofa, a chair, a table, anything you can kind of either lift up, drag, move. Okay? What's immovable property? Thank you very much. Land, a house, all of these things are what we call immovable property. Now there's differences. The way we're going to acquire movable property to the way we're going to acquire immovable property. Now, the general consensus was that Hashem said, when you go into the land of Israel, the land belongs to me. Right? I own the land. And what I'm doing is I'm renting it out to you, basically. I'm allowing you to come into this land and to buy and to prosper and to wheel and to deal and to do everything as long as it's done honestly and in good faith. I got no problem. And as long also as you understand that the land is mine. Meaning, what does that mean? For example, that's where we have, for example, one of the laws of Shemitah. What is the laws of Shemitah? That every 7 years you have to let the land lay fallow. You can't do any work on the land. So if you're a farmer, can you plow? No. Can you thresh? No. Can you plant? No. The land has to lay fallow. Now you think to yourself, 1 second, what's going on over here? The rabbi just said that this property belongs to the owner. Yes, it does belong to the owner with certain stipulations. The stipulation is that it's God's land and it's God's blessing that's going to grow this economy, regardless of all of the, rules and regulations that you put in to make sure that inflation is not running rampant. All of this is going fine and the economy is working. But still, where does the blessing come from? Hashem. It comes from God. And therefore, we're going to put some restrictions upon how you do business. Okay. So we have these two types. One is movable and one is immovable objects. Okay. Just saying, Mark, I like that jacket. I'd like to buy that jacket from you. No? Thank you very much. How much would you like for that jacket? $100. I'm willing to pay $100 for that jacket. Have I acquired that jacket? No. Absolutely means absolutely nothing. I could walk away from Mark and I owe him nothing. He could walk away from me and have no obligations to me, because words do not make an acquisition. Just simply setting a price and saying, okay, you know what? The fact is that I like that jacket. And he says, good, I'm going to sell you that jacket. No, that doesn't. Now, it wouldn't be very nice of Mark after all of the negotiations back and forth, and I take time and effort and coming and then going around everybody else's jacket and coming up with a price and putting effort into it, and I come back and I say, now I want to sell the jacket, and he says, okay, and then he backs out of the deal. It's not a very nice guy. Not really a nice guy. And he would probably get what we call a Misha Para. That means there's a special blessing that we would put upon him, because the guy backed out of a deal after everything was said and done. But as far as ownership is concerned, there's nothing that I can do to get that jacket. How can I acquire? It has to be done with one word, and I want you to remember, if anything tonight, this is the word I want you to remember. Kinyan. Kinyan. Kinyan means an act of acquisition. There has to be an act done between me and Mark. And I'm going to go through a number of series of acts that we're going to go through in order for me to be able to acquire ownership of that jacket. Now, what does it really matter? Because, if we don't buy, we don't buy. But, for example, let's say it's not a jacket. Let's say we're talking about an ox. Okay? And there's an ox sitting here in the room, and we've previously studied in our Talmud discussions about goring and damages and torts, right? So, Mark has an ox. I say, oh, I like that ox. I'd like to buy it. Mark says $100. Then the ox goes out and gores. Who's responsible? Who?
You. The person who didn't.
Am I responsible? No. It's Mark's ox. Mark's ox. I say, I want to, no. I say, I want to buy the ox. He says 100. I say yes. The ox goes out. Who's responsible for the damages? Mark. Because nothing. The only way I can acquire ownership of that ox is by doing what? A kinyan. Making a kinyan. Have to make a kinyan. I got to do something. Now, let's go through. There are 3 types of property that one can acquire. 3 types of property. One is ownerless. What's an example of ownerless property?
Desert.
Well, it's hard to acquire a desert, but desert land. But think about. But I'm talking about movable objects. Think of movable objects. What? Things that have been thrown away. Thank you very much. That means the person has given up ownership of it. He's lost something. I lose $5 on the street. Someone else picks it up. There's no way that there's no sign, there's no simon, there's nothing that connects that $5 to me. Ownerless. What? I've despaired. I've given up ownership, and that's exactly what Lori said. Something you've thrown away, you've given up ownership. Anybody can acquire that. Another example would be fish. Right? Anybody can go out fishing. Fish are ownerless. No one could claim that they own the fish. Catching wild animals. No one can claim ownership over those wild animals. So all of these fall into this category of what we call ownerless. Ownerless things. Now, court also had an ability to make your property ownerless. Like if, for example, if you didn't pay your taxes, or if like today, or if you did something that upset the court, they had a right under circumstances to say hefker bezin, that the court would say, this ox does not belong to Mark anymore. We're sorry for whatever reason. You didn't take care of it. You're not a good boss. You're not a good owner. And they made it. So once that thing is ownerless, we all 1, 2, 3, and we run after the ox. And whoever jumps on the ox first, and whoever drags it first, whoever did this, and then we're all going to be fighting over the ox. So therefore, there's a number of different ways how we have ownerless property. Okay. Number 2 is property with owners. Right? And what would be an example of something done? A sale, right? You have something, I want it, selling it, a gift, right? Even if Mark says to me, hey, you know what, I want to give you the jacket. Rabbi, I seen you buying that jacket every week I come to shul, and I see you buying the jacket. I decided with my wife, I'm getting a new jacket, I'd like to gift you the jacket. Okay? Even with gifting me the jacket, I have not received ownership of it. It's not mine until I'm going to do one of the types of kinyan. Either I put it on or whatever it is. So 2 is types of property, ownerless property, property with owners. And the third type is contractual. Okay? Contractual, which is not really buying something or having ownership or personal rights. So for example, I assume your debts. Now I haven't really acquired anything. I've assumed your debts. So someone owes you money. I want to buy it, or I want to pay off your debt, or whatever it is. There's a certain way that I have to acquire that. It's just not simply by saying, hey, you know what? Mark, I want to take over your debts, whatever it is, or hiring a workman. So these are called contractual things. Something has to be done in order. If I just say, Tim, I'd like to hire you and your crew, or whatever it is, doesn't mean anything. I have to actually sit down and make a kinyan between me and Tim and his crew. Okay. So let's think about some of the ways that we can actually acquire property within the Judaic system. Okay? One is what we call chatzer, which is a courtyard, meaning I own a home. Okay? In the back of my house is a backyard. People have backyards here, whatever it is, a porch. That backyard becomes a receptacle to make a kinyan. Meaning that, I say, Mark, I'd like to buy that jacket. He says, no problem, I'll drop it off tomorrow. He takes his jacket. As he's driving his car, he throws it into my backyard. He flips it into my backyard. That backyard has made the kinyan. The fact that he threw it, it landed in my backyard. My backyard is covered from 4 sides. There's fences. Very important to have that fence there, because if it's just open, then not much. You have to have a backyard that's secured so no one else can get in there. But once that jacket lands in my backyard, it's mine. Or you know what? If someone was throwing out, like Gloria had mentioned before about ownerless things, someone was throwing something out and they got frustrated, and they threw it, it ended up in my backyard. No one else, I can't jump into my backyard, or I can't jump into your backyard and to grab it out. It's mine. It's mine. Now, when does this have certain ramifications? So of course, the case of Mark throwing his jacket in, but what if in a divorce case, right, where I have to give my wife a get? Not me personally, but I'm just saying theoretically. I don't want to imply anything here. I don't want to get into any personal business over here. But I'm just saying here, if you have to give your wife a divorce, and divorce has to be hers. The divorce is not final until she gets the get in her hand, and you drive by and throw the get into her backyard. If she owns the backyard, as soon as it hits the floor, it's her get, and the marriage is dissolved. Okay, so that's one way. Now, why would this pertain? Why is this true? Because your premises, and of course it would extend not only to a backyard. If I threw it through your front window, your home, by extension, becomes you. Your premises, as long as it's guarded, as long as it's, people don't have a right to go in there without your permission, that becomes an extension of your arm, and then you can, that makes an acquisition for you. And later on, Mark cannot say, well, I regret it. It's too bad. Flew in, it hit the ground, it's mine. Thank you very much. And that's also true for ownerless property. If a bird should fall down in my property, or the wind should pick something up and deliver it into my property, as long as it's in my property, it belongs to me. Thank you very much. Okay? Go ahead, please.
Is there any intent that's required? Like if I throw a baseball at
No intent. No intent. As long as it's mine, intent has to be that you want to give up the baseball.
Yeah, if I don't want to
Yeah.
because I just accidentally...
Oh, no. No, if it accidentally flies into my property, then of course I don't acquire it. It still belongs to you. It has to be where, you want to get rid of the baseball, but instead of giving it to my hand, instead of me actually taking it from you, if you threw it into my backyard, I own it already. I own it. So if I said to you, okay, you know what, Mark? I want to buy the cow, but I'm not going to be around for a couple of days. Why don't you put it in my backyard? Okay? So Mark schleps the cow or the ox down and puts it in my backyard, closes the door. Okay? The ox gets nervous. Okay? And then he gores. Who pays the damage? Me. I pay the damage. Because as soon as it came into my backyard, then I acquired it. No, but there has to be, of course, intent for the guy to give up ownership of it. Okay? By extension, the rabbis came to an interesting understanding that not only is your property and your premises an extension of what you are, but everybody has within themselves rights to acquire something within 4 cubits of their body. What do I mean by 4 cubits of their body? So I'm walking down the street, okay? And I come into so if I'm walking down Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, all bets are off. But if I'm walking, okay, because there's too many people and everybody else was 4 cubits, okay? But if I'm in this little cul-de-sac, and I'm there and a guy's driving down the street and he says, this jacket, I hate this jacket. And he takes off this jacket, he rolls down his window and he flings the jacket out of his car, and it flies and it falls within 4 cubits of me. I'm just standing there minding my own business, waiting for the bus, and the jacket fell within 4 cubits. Now how much is a cubit? A cubit's about 2 feet. So figure about 8 feet, okay, on each side, or let's say 6 feet, let's say it's 1.5 feet, 6 feet on each side of me, and it fell within 4 cubits of me, and we're in this little cul-de-sac. I acquired it. Why? Because I have the opportunity, since there's nobody milling around, I have the opportunity of going over and picking up that jacket and taking it to me. So by extension, the 6 feet on either side of me in a circumference, I'm going to be standing in the middle of this circle, and it lands within. Now there's certain, of course, you can't. This does not apply again in a reshus harabim, in a public domain. That means again, if you're walking in Fifth Avenue and someone drops a ring, you're not acquiring it. No, don't think that that's going to happen. It only happens within certain circumstances, and the rabbis wanted to show because you have a bit of ownership, not ownership in the sense of where you own the land, but since it's close to you and the jacket fell within proximity of you, you could go ahead and as soon as it lands in your 4 cubits, you've acquired it. Go ahead, Mark.
Marvin. If you don't want it.
Oh no, then you don't have to take it. Then you don't have to take it. Now I'm talking about a case. We're talking about a case where I wanted to buy the jacket, and Mark threw it at me. It landed near me, or again in the case of the divorce, I threw it at my wife, and it landed at her feet. As soon as it landed at her feet, she's acquired the divorce. I could go now and marry.
That's Jewish law.
Yes.
In Israel. But
Okay, we're not getting into Israel because I'm talking ancient Israel. Ancient Israel, not today.
Okay.
I'm not talking about today. Today Israel is governed by different rules and regulations. I'm talking about back in the times of biblical ancient Israeli law. That's what would happen. Now it has to be very specific. I'm only talking about a cul-de-sac. I'm not talking about if you're walking down PCH. I'm talking about a place where you can have some kind of proprietary ownership of the spot where no one else is going to infringe upon it. Okay, so those two are of one type, because that's just an extension of who you are, meaning whether it's your premises or whether it's the 4 cubits around you. A much more viable and I'm sure more common was if I talk to Mark, I say, Mark, hello, I'd like to buy the ox. How much? $100. We say, hey, okay, we agree. I haven't done anything. I go to the ox and I grab the ox and I pull the ox. Once I get the ox to walk and I have a hold of it, I've acquired ownership of it. This is called what we call meshicha. I make the ox go. I have done something to show that there's ownership on my part. Now, if I can pick it up, if it's a book, and Mark says, here's the book, and I pick up the book, I've done that. That's enough. Dayenu. Or if we transfer it, that means he's holding it and he gives it over to me, and I take it, that's enough. Simply. Money doesn't have to be passed around. We know we've decided on a price, we've decided to sell it, I've done something. And as long as I haven't done this, as long as I just look at the ox and I survey the ox and I even touched the ox, no. I got to give the ox a good slap in the tuchnis and the ox walks, 2 feet, I've done it. I can't pick up the ox, but if it's a little lamb, pick it up, that's it. Why? Because dvarim, mere words itself, are not enough. Now think about that for a second. Why would that be true, that mere words are not enough? But you know why? Because there's a lot of ambiguity and there's a lot of misunderstanding. And that's why we have today what? Contracts. Right? That's why we have contracts. Wherever you go, you have a contract. You park your car in a parking lot and the guy gives you a parking ticket. You ever look at the back of a parking ticket? It's got words this little. I don't know who can read that without a magnifying glass. And it's words and words and words telling you that you're responsible. We're not. Why? Why? Because mere words are ambiguous. He thought, I thought. You said, what, $100? I thought I heard 100 dinner. 100 Iraqi dinners. No, I didn't mean dinners. I thought I meant dinners, going out to dinner. That's what I wanted for the jacket. Okay, so then already we come, it's too ambiguous. So therefore the Torah demanded upon us to make sure that each side is comfortable with what they're doing, make a transaction, make a move, make an action, do something, make a kinyan. Make a kinyan. Okay. That's all we're talking about when we're dealing with movable objects. How do you acquire immovable objects? How do you acquire land? So acquire land is a number of ways. One, of course, is what we call chazakah. Chazakah is doing an act of ownership, meaning if I go in Mark's field and I put up a fence around this field, that pretty much shows that I own the field. All right? I mean, that's a pretty good sign that, and no one says anything. Again, this is very important, what these gentlemen said about intent. If Mark has no intention to sell his field, and I wake up one morning and I go down to Home Depot to buy fence, and I fence up Mark's field, it doesn't mean anything. Everybody knows this is Mark's field. I'm going ahead and I'm fencing off the field. And Mark's standing there and he's not saying anything. This is a pretty good sign that it belongs to me. That's a chazakah. Now, if Mark should make a macha, if Mark should say, "Hey, what are you doing? It's my field. I don't want to sell it to you. I had no intention to sell it to you." Do I acquire the field? No, because he made what we call a macha. He made a protest. Now, what happens if Mark's gone? I want the field. He and Cindy decide they're going to take a little vacation. And while they're on vacation, I go ahead and I fence off his field. Okay? Now, we didn't talk about it. We didn't do anything. And I sit there for 3 years without Mark making what we call a macha, without Mark making a protest. After 3 years, unless he can show that there's no way he could have known that I fenced off the field, I own the field. Because what happens is, if Mark walks by the field, and he sees that I went ahead and I did a fence, and he says nothing. And we haven't even talked about it. We've never even said, but I thought, I like the field, it's adjacent, and I made a move. He says nothing. Day 1 goes by, says nothing. Day 2 goes by. A year goes by, 2. After 3 years, I'm a squatter. I've just won his field. Then he could scream Chai v'Kayim. He could scream to high heaven. It's not going to help him. He has to make that announcement soon, because after 3 years, the court says, "Listen, Mark, come on. You saw the guy in your field. He was eating of your fruit. He planted in your field. He did something. He has a chazakah. He has what they call squatter's rights, and he's acquired that field. But if Mark makes a protest, then of course I have to get out." So normally, a chazakah is anything that I do to show ownership that I bought this. So if I bought a house, and I go ahead and I change the locks, would that be a chazakah? Of course, right? That would absolutely be a chazakah. Because you would be standing over there and I'm changing the locks of the house. The court would see, or people would walk by and they would see that, you know what, he's changing the locks. This is an act of ownership. You own the house. Okay, fine. Then we came into something that we call money. Money. Money became a usable thing. Now money in and of itself is a very interesting thing. Because what is it? What is money really in and of itself? The property of money. It's a bill. What does this bill say? This bill says that the government will pay on it. What do you mean the government will pay on it? It's a government property, money. It's something that we agreed on, that we use this in substitute for other materials. Because, I want to buy your house. So instead of telling you, okay, Mark, what would you like? And you would say, well, I'd like a trip and maybe 6 oxen and 7 cows, a dowry for my daughter and this and that, So we make it simple. How much? $100,000, which is, of course, I'm only joking because it's California. What can you get for $100,000? Not even a car, maybe. So you know what? He says $100,000. We agree. I give him the $100,000, Kinyan Kesef. Once he's accepted the money, he can't go back on it. You can't go back on it. That's what we call Kinyan of Kesef. So we have money and we have a chazakah. Those 2 things. And the third thing that falls into within this category of immovable objects is a deed. Is a shtar. And a shtar basically says, I acquire the field from Mark, and we have witnesses on the deed. Now, as long as the deed is written, doesn't mean anything. I could write the deed all day. When do I acquire the field? When? Well, there's no signing of a deed when the deed gets into Mark's hands. See? If you take a look at a ketubah, you'll find something very interesting. And then you bring up an absolutely good point. You know what? A ketubah is a marriage contract. I'm sorry, if there's any terminology I use that you're not familiar with, please don't be shy. A ketubah is a marriage contract. That what does it do? It obligates the groom for certain specific damages that he's going to have to pay if he divorces his wife. That's all. That's basically what the ketubah says. I love her and care for her. Yeah, blah, 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 yada, yada, yada. Great. But the bottom line is what a ketubah does is it protects the woman from damages that if he divorces her, he has to pay $200 silver dollars or $400 silver dollars. Now, the groom doesn't sign on the ketubah. Who signs? 2 witnesses. When is the ketubah good? When is it good? When he takes ownership of the ketubah. Right? So when Mark takes ownership of the deed, as long as the deed is written, but Mark is not taking ownership of it, it doesn't mean anything. When I take the deed and I hand it over to Mark, he takes it, picks it up, whatever it is, that's when now, at that moment, I own the field already. Once you've already taken ownership of the deed, I own the field. So whether I make a chazakah, whether I do something that proves that I own the field, or I give you a deed, or I give you money, these are the 3 ways.
Self-serving process.
Exactly. It's a process that you have to do something. Something has to come into your hand to be able to acquire that. Now, it's very interesting, and I just want to, just for a moment, go back to the drawing board for a second. And I have not left the building. Elvis is still in the building. Okay? You remember once upon a time there was a woman by the name of Ruth. All right? Now Ruth is one of the books of the Bible. Ruth was a great convert, was a wonderful lady, held in great high esteem. Okay? One of the things if we look way back in Ruth, and what page is Ruth? What page are we going to find Ruth on? Page 1269. If we look at the 4th chapter and the 7th verse of Ruth, it goes something like this. I'm going to read a couple of sentences beforehand. Now we know Ruth comes and she's poor, and she Boaz is eventually going to be her husband, and she goes and she gleans from the fields. Boaz, meanwhile, had gone up to the gate and sat down there. Just then the Redeemer, of whom Boaz had spoken, passed by. I'm not going to tell you what the Redeemer is yet. He said, "Come over here, sit down, Ploini Aloini." I guess that was his name. And he came over and sat down. He then took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit here." And they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, "The parcel of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech," which was Ruth's father-in-law, and I try to concentrate on this, "is being offered for sale by Naomi, his wife, who has returned from the fields of Moab." She was poor, destitute. She needed money quickly. She said, what's going to happen? So she puts up the field for sale. Now, who has the first right to buy the field? The Redeemer. Who's the Redeemer? A relative. So if I become destitute and I want to sell it, the first person who has a right to buy that is a relative of mine. Okay? I resolved that I should inform you to this effect. So Boaz is telling this to Ploini Aloini, who was a relative. "Buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people." Here's one of the clearest cases in the Bible of acquisitions, mergers and acquisitions. Because he's telling them, buy the field. Okay? "If you are willing to redeem, redeem. But if you will not redeem, tell me that I may know, for if there's no one else to redeem it but you, and I after you." And he said, "I am willing to redeem." Then Boaz said, "The day you buy the field from Naomi, you must also buy from Ruth the Moabite, wife of the deceased, to perpetuate the name of the deceased on his inheritance." Meaning you got to get the field and you get Ruth with the field. Oh, Ruth with the field now. Oh, now, okay, so she has to get the field, and Ruth comes with the field because, she now becomes a levirate marriage. So then he says, hold on. The Redeemer said, "That I cannot redeem for myself, lest I imperil my own inheritance." Because if I come home and I said, "Guess what, honey? Guess what I just bought today? I bought a field and Ruth." No, that I'm not going to do. That I'm not going to do. "Take over my redemption responsibility." So he tells this to Boaz. "Take over my redemption responsibility on yourself, for I am unable to redeem." I can't. I'm not taking her home. I mean, she's beautiful and everything, and she's great, and I'd love to have her, but you know what? Forget about it. My wife is going to clobber me, so I'm not going to do it. "Formally," now here's where the interesting part comes, because normally we don't have in the Bible, it says many hints of how business was transacted. So it says like this, in Ruth, "Formerly this was done in Israel in cases of redemption and exchange transactions." Okay, redemptions and exchange transactions. Okay, remember that just for a moment. "To validate all matters, one would draw off his shoe." So if you're saying to me, "Okay, listen, I don't want to do it anymore, you take it." We took off a shoe, okay, and give it to the other. This was the process of ratification in Israel. Okay? So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself," he drew off his shoe. Okay? So now we have a little bit of an inkling. We see in the story of Ruth that there was a number of ways how you can acquire, and none of them were what we talked about before. There was no money passed. There was no deed written. There was no chazakah made. Nothing. No fences made. No locks changed. How was it done? Well, look. Let's go back. It was said in verse number 7. "Formerly this was done in cases of redemption and exchange transactions." Exchange transactions, meaning kinyan chalipin. They came out, the rabbis, and gleaned from this that how do we make an acquisition? We exchange, meaning, you know what? I would like to buy that jacket from you, Mark. Okay, you know what? $100, fine, good. You know what? This is my book. Take this and give me the jacket. As soon as I hand you the book and I take the jacket, the deal is done. Even though, what's the caveat over here? No, he gets to keep the book. He gets to keep the book. But you know what? The book The book and the jacket are not of equal value. They're not of equal value. So that doesn't matter. If I make a kinyan chalipin and you're willing to exchange the book for the jacket, and they're not of equal value, but as soon as we make that exchange, I give you a pen for that jacket, I'll give you a pen for the ox, I'll give you a pen for something. Once the exchange is done, the transaction is finished. It's done. Now we could talk about how much extra I owe you. I have to pay another $30, $40, $50, whatever it is. But even if the two items of value are not equal, exchange becomes very important. And that's why you'll see, next time you go to a Jewish wedding, okay, go to a Jewish wedding, and the rabbi is going to be there with the groom, okay? And we talked about the ketubah. We talked about signing and making the ketubah, the marriage document, valid. What's going to happen? This is the way it's going to work. They're all going to sit around the table. They're going to take out the marriage contract, and they're going to read it. They can say, on this and this day, this and this place, this and this groom said to this and this bride, please be my wife according to all the rules and regulations in Israel, and I will love you and cherish you and accept me. I'm also giving you 200 golden zuzim, silver zuz. And on top of that, I add myself another 200. And 200 come from your whatever it is. And everything that you brought in from your father's house, I'm going to be responsible. And I will pay this, whether it's going to be in movable objects, unmovable objects, from the shirt on my back. And a lengthy contract. And it's going to be witnessed by two witnesses, unrelated to the groom or to the bride. Then the rabbi is going to say to the groom, you've read it? Yes? You understand your responsibility? Yes. The rabbi is going to reach into his pocket and take out a handkerchief. Okay? This is going to be done. He's going to give it to the groom and he's going to tell to the groom, I would like you to lift up this handkerchief. Pick it up in the air. And the groom is going to pick it up like this in the air. And that is then the rabbi is going to look at the two witnesses and say, did you witness this? Yes. Sign on the dotted line. Why the lifting up of the handkerchief? Thank you very much. Tim, could you say that again? Kinyan. Because the deed does not go into effect until we make a kinyan. Kinyan sudar, the kinyan of a handkerchief, is the act of acquisition where the groom is now acquiring that deed to himself. He has to pick something up. He has to make a show of something in order to tell the world, I'm buying it. Now, it could have been done a number of different ways. He could have, chalipin, he could have exchanged with the rabbi something, but kinyan sudar, the kinyan of picking up a handkerchief, is enough to get you to be responsible for everything that's written in that document. Now, if you go to other places, like for example, before the wedding, there is what they call, this is the marriage document. There is also what some people write is engagement documents, meaning Tanoim. How do you get to a marriage? You know what? The two sides agree. The groom's side agrees they're going to bring the groom to the marriage. The bride side agrees they'll bring the bride to the marriage. They both come together. Now, the rabbi stands there and he says, okay, you're going to, Mark, you've done a marriage. Your son got married. You brought him to the wedding. You went to the other side. They said, your daughter, she's everything, whatever you writ there. Then they're going to go to Mark. Mark, please pick this up. To the father of the bride, please pick this up. Why? Because that now forces them and makes them responsible for all of the expenses of the wedding. And if Mark says, hey, you know what, I just thought about that, but I don't like the way this guy's looking at me, my mechutn, as they say, the other side, and I said, the in-laws, and I don't like the way they spoke to me, and there's a blow-up, which is unfortunately not uncommon among Jewish weddings, that the in-laws don't get along, and they say the wedding is off. Too bad, baby. And when you picked up that thing, what you did is when you lifted up that handkerchief from the rabbi's hand, you now agreed to fulfill all the obligations that it says in the Tanaim, that you were going to now bring your son, you were going to prepare him and make sure that he has a talis, and he makes sure that he has a kittel, and all the things, she was going to bring clothing and all of that stuff. Now, you break off the wedding, you're going to be responsible to pay for damages. Because just by lifting up the thing, you've already acquired responsibility of that. So, be careful when you see a rabbi walking down the street and he's offering you a handkerchief and you haven't sneezed. Be very, very careful of what you're going to raise. You want to make sure that you understand quite clearly all the ramifications of what the rabbi has in mind, because a kinyan sudar is probably the most common now of all kinyans, because it's so easy to do. So let's say, for example, when would be another case that we would do a kinyan sudar before? I beg your pardon? Oh, perfect. Exactly. Before you sell your chametz. Right, you want to sell out all of your leavened goods before Passover, because there's a prohibition in the Torah of owning any leavened good. So you go to the rabbi and say, Rabbi, I want you to buy all of my leavened, all my bread, my donuts, my crackers, my who knows what else you have over there, my cheesecakes, my lemon meringue pies. What do you have to do? Kinyan sudar. Sign the document and pick up the handkerchief. Once you pick up the handkerchief, he's acquired all of your leaven. That he then goes to the Gentile and he sells it to the Gentile, and goodbye. I don't think the Gentile has to lift up the handkerchief, but I think the Jew, all of that thing. So therefore, all of this is most common because it's very easy, and it shows not only words but actually deeds have a very, very strong and profound effect on acquisitions, mergers and acquisitions. Now, we read over there about taking off the shoe. So I'm just going to end off this part of it with two other things. One is any type of custom. If we in the shul by the shore had a custom that we do a little dance every time we do an acquisition, that's good enough. So if I say, hey, Mark, let's get up there and we do, and 2 times around the bima, and that's what our custom is to square off an acquisition. Once we've done the little dance, that's the way. Just like they did in Ruth, what did they do? Thank you very much. They took off the shoe, and once the guy took off his shoe, that was already shown that the acquisition, that the transaction was done. And last but not least is the handshake. The old kiyas kaf, as we say, that a handshake is valid. Meaning once we agree on a price, and once we have said something, and I shake your hand, that is a kinyan. But if I go like this, and you go, hoo, just joking, you pull back your hand without shaking my hand, that's not, no. But all of these things I just brought as examples that why we do these things is because words, when we talk, are not good enough. As the Rambam writes in the first law, the very first law of acquisitions, Maimonides brings down, and all the chapters and all the rules that come afterwards is hamikach einan nikna bedvarim. Matter, anything could not be acquired through words. Even if there are witnesses, he writes. Even if there are witnesses, Ketzad, what kind of a case are we talking about? This house I am selling it to you. This wine I am selling to you. And then uposko bedvarim, and we already established a price. And the buyer says, yes, Konisi, I want to buy. And the seller says, Macharti, I'm selling. And the witnesses say, Hevolenu Eidim, we saw that this guy sold and this guy bought. Hareze Eini Klum. This means absolutely nothing. 2 witnesses are standing there and you are saying on Shabbos, Mark, I don't want to talk about this on Shabbos, but I see the cars for sale, how much, this, and then sitting in the back row are 2 guys who should be davening, but they're listening to our conversation, and they heard, yes, the rabbi went over to Mark, he wants to buy his car, Mark wants to sell him his car. Do I acquire Mark's car? Ze eine klum means nothing. Ukeilu, and then the Maimonides adds, Ukeilu lo yehoye b'neim dvorim ha'olam. And it's as if they've never spoken. It doesn't even have any validity. Nothing, zero, zilch. They've never had this conversation. And the same thing is true, he says, about a present and other matters of acquisition. And that's why the rabbis were very, very careful to make sure and certain that, like you had mentioned before, that there was intent on both sides. And as soon as I drag the cow or I drag the ox and you're standing there and you don't say anything, it becomes mine. Okay? Go ahead, please.
In the matter of the wedding, you were saying about you get to the ceremony with the kerchief and the in-laws and so forth. But prior to that, obviously, much has been committed.
Correct.
Do they actually write contracts when they make a commitment?
That's a very, very good question. Excellent question. The question was, let me just repeat it for the, for the crowd. I had mentioned before about the contracts at a wedding. And we're talking about the ketubah is signed only about 15 or 20 minutes before the ceremony itself. But a lot has already been done prior to this. So so the way every community has its own various customs. Our custom is, I'll give just you in Chabad, when it comes to a wedding. The groom and the bride get together and the family agrees to get married. Okay, perfect, wonderful. Okay, what does that mean? I have no responsibility just because we met and the parents met and the groom and the bride said yes. I have no. That night or the next night or whatever it is, we have what we call a l'chaim. We invite all of our friends over and everybody, we lift a glass, everybody toasts the groom and the bride. At that moment, what we do is we have a little contract, not that we sign, but the rabbi comes over to the groom and to the bride, and they say to the groom and the bride that you are taking upon yourself responsibility to marry this girl, and the same thing to the girl to marry this boy. No more is said, no more is mentioned. Handkerchief is taken out of the pocket, the groom lifts it, the bride lifts it, and that's it. Okay? Now what have they just agreed to do now? They've agreed to go to the wedding. Now, once they've agreed to go to the wedding, so if it should be that your side went ahead, Mark, and you ordered the flowers and you got the place and all of this, and then they decided to break it off, you have a right to go to them and demand whatever it is, 50% or whatever they were going to pay, that they need to make restitutions. Other communities actually have what they're called tenoyim. It's not a wedding, but it's engagement contracts. That means that you, Mark, because you're bringing in the groom, are responsible for bringing him with A, B, C, D, E. He has to have underwear, and he has to have, clean shirts, and, make sure Cindy's going to make sure that he comes well prepared, and the talis, tefillin, all of that stuff. Same thing is true about the bride. She's responsible, the father of the bride is going to make sure she comes with the linens and the this and the that, whatever you want to write in there. And then, today there's probably much standard. Once it's signed, that's it. You're responsible. And if anybody should break off the wedding, the other side has a right to get back restitutions. Now, there's also a gray area, because what happens is, the first time in our customs is when there's an engagement, the groom and the bride receive presents from the parents. They receive presents. The bride receives silver candlesticks, a beautiful necklace. The groom receives, a set of shas, the whole set of the Talmud or other books, or a gold watch or whatever. Now, what happens if they would break it off in the middle? If they break it off in the middle. So then you have to come to some kind of, most people will give back the presents. I mean, if you haven't gone through the whole reason I gave you the present, even though, did you acquire them? Of course you acquired them, right? Because the moment you took the watch from your father-in-law's hand and you put it on your wrist, I think that's a pretty good sign that it belongs to you, right? But if you don't go through the wedding, you have to give it back. You got to give back the presents. So it becomes a little touchy situation. In order not to avoid all of this, Chabad's custom is that contract, called not the marriage contract, but the engagement contract, is signed 5 minutes before the wedding. Why do we do that 5 minutes before the wedding? Just to make sure that nobody has any trouble. But it becomes null and void as soon as the chuppah takes place. All of it is null and void because I brought him to I brought my daughter to the chuppah, and and that becomes that's nothing. But in contracts, you have to be careful and make sure that you know your rights before lifting up because once you lift it up, there's no buyer's remorse after that. You can't say, well, I thought she was blonde and now I see that she's not. I mean, I know a case of a girl who married a friend of mine. She didn't know because every date that they went on, he wore his black hat. Right? We wear black hats, and then certainly when you're dating, you want to look proper, so you wear a black hat. She never saw him without his black hat on. Now, comes the day of the Ufruf, right? The day that he gets called up to receive the Torah. What do we do at an Ufruf? There's a thing. Thank you very much. Lori, can you say a little louder?
Throw candy.
You throw candy. right? So the groom gets up there, and he's called up to the Torah, right? And he makes the blessing, and everybody in the crowd has this little bag of candy. Well, someone throws the candy, and guess what? A black hat gets knocked off, and what's underneath his black hat? Nothing. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Marvin. You hit it. Because you know what? There's no hanky-panky in Chabad before the wedding. You don't know. She's standing there. Someone knocks off his black hat. His black hat goes flying. She expects underneath his black hat to be some hair. And the guy is bald. Bald. Okay? So she goes, ah! In the crowd. She goes, oh my God, in the crowd. And this is like 4 days before the wedding. It's a fine time to tell me, Louise, right? That, you have, all of these things. But the wedding went through and they're happy and they're, everything. But, so you got to be, when before you pick that thing up, tell them, you know what, I'm lifting this up, but how about you pick up your hat? Pick up your hat. So you don't want to have anything that could absolutely go wrong at the wedding and find out that the guy, is not what you expected him to be. Not expected him to be. Okay. Now, all of this is we talk about acquisitions that we buy and that we acquire that becomes ours. What does that mean? It becomes ours means that we have all the responsibilities, rights, everything to that article. Meaning, if that article goes out and damages, I'm responsible. I have only exclusive rights to use that article. I have rights to exclude you from coming into my property and to using my property and to touching my goods. Everything is mine, except in certain circumstances. And when do I say? All of this is true when we talk about movable objects. So if I sell you a couch, once you take it, I have absolutely no rights, no connection, nothing to that couch anymore. I walk home, you walk home, I don't want to see that couch anymore. Immovable objects is very different. Very, very different. What do I mean very different? There's rules and regulations how they're governed. For example, in the Torah it says that a field shall not be sold in perpetuity. So if I came out of Egypt, the Perelmuter family, we came out of Egypt, I came out with my 4 sons, we walked 40 years in the desert, we finally made it to Israel, I'm exhausted by now, but you know what? We got a piece of land. We got a piece of land since we're from the tribe of, let's say, Zvulun, let's just say Zebulun, for whatever reason. We got the coastal land, and I got a beautiful piece of land up in northern Israel. Okay? We're not farmers. Okay? So we go bankrupt. Our farm goes right into the dread. So right next to us is this big cooperative of some guy that knows how to farm. I want to sell him my farm. My piece of land, which I received because just by right that I was one of the walkers out of Egypt, I got a piece of land. That land is always going to belong to the Perelmuters. That land will never leave the Perelmuter estate. And even if I sell it to the Halperns, they are farmers and they know how to farm and all of that stuff, and I sell it to Mark, at the end of 50-year Jubilee, that land comes back to me. Comes back. Now I could again turn around and sell it again to Mark for another 50 years and keep doing that, but every 50 years that land will come back to me. And he could not fool me. Because if there's 2 years, if there's 48 years left to Jubilee, there's a very long time. He needs to pay me a lot of money because 48 years he's going to farm the land. But if there's only 2 years left to Jubilee, I can't charge him the same price I could charge him if there's 48 years left to Jubilee. So we have to be careful, both the buyer and the seller, to know when that Jubilee year comes. If you don't know and you're a schmeiger, you're a schlemazel, okay, the joke's on you. Guess what? I just sold you a great piece of land that's only going to be yours for 2 years. All right, and in 2 years it comes back into my property. Why is this so? Think about this for a second. Why would God institute that fields and lands and farms can never be sold in perpetuity? What does this stop from happening? What this stops is 2 things. 1, chaos. So you don't know who owns the land. Land comes here, land goes there, here, bits and pieces. You're off your land, and no. This is your land. You stay on the land. That's the way it is. You want to sell it. You want to rent it. Fine. Second, you know what else it stops? Think about this for a second. Land barons.
Well,
always be owned by Jews.
Yeah, it will always be owned by Jews. That's absolutely, absolutely. But it stops one person from acquiring a tremendous amount of land, right? So even if you got the Bill Gates of farming, and he goes out there and he what do you call when you take out a loan? You leverage your field, right? And you buy another field. Then you keep leveraging, and before you know it, you bought half of the tribe of Zvulun. Now, what the heck? One guy owns thousands and thousands and thousands of acres. Only till Jubilee year. Because once Jubilee year comes, everything goes back to their natural state. Okay? Everything goes back to the natural state. So therefore, God in his ultimate wisdom realized that there's always going to be people like Gates and Ford and J.P. Morgan and all of these guys, great entrepreneurs, and things that are going to gobble, gobble, gobble. We're not going to let them gobble, gobble, gobble. There's going to be a system where people are going to have some dignity. Because why? Because most people sell their land because they're impoverished, right? They're poor. So therefore, you know what? No. There's got to be dignity to this. I allow people to make money, but there has to be some kind of a system. Some kind of a system. And this is also true when it comes to selling houses, which was very, very interested. So in a house, in a walled city, if you had a house, what's a walled city, for example? Jericho, Jerusalem. In a walled city, the person had 1 year to redeem his home. So let's say, you know what, I can't make my mortgage payments, so I sell it to Lori, in a house, and she buys it from me. I have 1 year in the contract that says that I have 1 year that I could come back, give you back your money, and I buy back my house. And that's what's called the redeemer. So somebody else comes and says, hey, you know what, I know that my brother Abba is out, I want to redeem the house. They have a right to redeem it. And you know that. And you know that there's a 1 year window that I could come back to you. As much as you love the house, I'm telling you, hey, if you're going to remodel or do anything, be aware that I could still come to you and buy back that house. Once that year is done, it's over. You have bought that house in perpetuity. That's only in a walled city. Once the year is over, I walk away from the house. You have the house, I can drive by it, I can look at it, I could sit there, misty-eyed, wondering what could have been, but the house belongs to you. In an unwalled city, any place like near a border or something like that, you could never buy a house in perpetuity. All you could do is rent the house till Jubilee year. When Jubilee year came, just like the fields, it went back to its original owners. And if you think about that for a second, it's the same principle there. Not so much about the land grab, but it's because of the chaos. Because God wanted more stability in unwalled cities. So therefore he made sure that when you own the house, you own it. Now you could rent it out, you could lease it, you can do whatever you want with it. But as in a Jubilee year, it goes back to its original state. This always reminds us that God, and only God, is the true owner of all property. Right now, we'll just take a 10-second. One last thing that I wanted to talk about was there was something in Judaism in ancient times called slavery. Slavery. And this was an acquisition. You acquired human beings. And I thought that, I thought, should I mention, not mention, but I thought it would be interesting to mention this because that's very different than today in America. In America, you cannot own a slave. No, it's illegal to own a slave in America. I beg you what? Tell Susan. It's a different kind of slave. That's a different kind of, that's an indentured servant. That's very different. In Judaism, you were allowed to own slaves. Now, what exactly did that mean that you were allowed to own slaves? One, a Jewish person who had no money, he was completely impoverished, was allowed to sell himself. Meaning, I come to you not as a worker. This is not a hired man that we say, okay, you know what, fix my shutters and I'll pay you. No. You actually became a servant, or an eved it's called, an eved, a servant to the master. Meaning, you were completely 100% completely owned by the guy. So if he told you, you know what, go pick up my laundry, you went pick up his laundry. Go polish my shoes, you went to polish his shoes. You lived there. You only had him for 6 years. That was the most that you could have a person working for you. After 6 years, he had a right to say goodbye. I worked enough. I have a little bit of money. I'm out. I want out. Now, we're going to get to the year thing in a second. The other way a person could sell himself into slavery was if he was a thief. If he was a real ganef. It means he stole something. It was worth $1,000. He couldn't pay it back. They put him on the selling block. Who would like to buy this guy? And he would work till he paid off his debt. And then he would go free. Once he could show that he paid off his debt, he could go free. Now make no mistake. This was not a hired person. A hired person usually works for you and then goes home. This guy slept in your house. You had to feed him. You had to do everything to take care of him. If he got sick, who paid for his medical expenses? You did. If he got married and he had a wife, who paid for her and his children? You did. They became literally financially your dependents 100%. And in return, he worked for you. Meaning that he had to do whatever you wanted. Now, the Torah tells you, hey, you don't take advantage. Come on. Just because the guy works for you, you can't tell him, you know what, why don't you carry the rocks from there to there? You know, well, that's nothing work. Just because, you know what, you're angry that he's not doing anything. There's no work, so he's sitting around, you know, like this in the yard. So you say, I'm so angry that he's not working. I'll get him to work. You know, do me a favor. I want you to do, no. That kind of busy work you couldn't make him do. But anything else, whatever needed to be done, he did it. Now, there was one step above that, meaning of the nations that lived in Israel. Means the nations that lived in Israel, the indigenous people, they can also be bought as slaves. They can be bought as slaves. So if you wanted to buy a Canaanite or a Perizzite or a Jesuite or whatever it was, those people that lived in Israel, you can acquire forever. They became your slaves forever. Now, if you wanted to release them, you could release them. But as long as you paid for them, and as long as you were willing to feed them and clothe them and house them and do all of these things, you know what? You owned them. You owned the slave. Now, it's interesting because I mentioned this because I wanted to just mention this other thing. It says in the Talmud, "Kol hakoine eved ki'ilu koine rabbi." Anybody who acquires a slave, we're talking about slavery here, that you can actually, just like you can buy a book, you can buy a person. In biblical times, you were able to, and they were under the certain circumstances, either they work forever for you or a certain period for you, whatever. But it says in the Talmud that anybody who acquired a slave, it's as if they acquired a master. Why? Because everything you do, you got to give to the slave. Meaning, you ate white bread, you got to give him white bread. You ate pumpernickel, you got to feed him pumpernickel. You sleep on it with a down blanket, you got to give him a down blanket. Everything you do, you cannot mistreat him. Now, you think to yourself, Rabbi Shalom, how in the world can we justify? Whenever we learn this in the Chumash, the first thing that people pop up and say, my God, because here in America we're so ingrained with slavery and anti-slavery and rules against slavery. And imagine if we would bring this up today. If one guy in Congress would get up there and say, you know what, in biblical times we had slaves. How about why don't we institute it now? You know what would happen to this? You know what would happen to this guy? And we're not talking about a certain race. Anybody, whoever wants to sell himself. If I go to Bill Gates and say, listen, I want to be your slave. I don't care. I want to work for you. Great, The guy would be tarred and feathered in Washington. Crazy guy. But in the olden times, they allowed slavery. And you think to yourself, how is this possible? But if you understand that number one, and most important, was the man had to understand the word dignity. Because we know that there are times when people are down and out. You go, there's homeless people. Now, okay, many of them are mentally ill. But there are actually people that live in cars. There are families that live in cars. And if you think to yourself, what's better? In all reality, take away the word slavery, but let's just say they're hired. Would it be much worse for a person to be hired and work for this family than living in a car? If you treated these people, if you mistreated them and you whipped them and you beat them and you tortured them, okay, all bets are off, obviously. But The key word in all of these things, that everything we talked about tonight, is one word: dignity. From the redeeming of the field to the handshake, to the acquisitions, all of these things came down to one thing, that we need to realize that however we deal with people, there has to be a two-sided dignity on each side of the fence. You can't have me taking advantage of you. And even if Mark sold me, and I'm not that knowledgeable about coats, but he came over to me and he sold me that coat for $2,000. $2,000! And I went home and I showed Chani my coat I just bought for $2,000. And she said, "Are you nuts? I just saw that coat in Marshall's, same jacket for $150. I could go back." This is called a mekach tos. This is called a bad and a mistaken transaction. Now, even though you could say, "Hey, you agreed to it, and you paid it." Yes, I did, but you took advantage of me, or I took advantage of you, or whatever the situation is. And if you did, I could retract that. I can retract, because there was a level of profit that was built into every transaction that you were allowed to make, whether it's a sixth or an eighth or a fourth or whatever it is. Now, if it was something that's something special, a diamond, a once in a lifetime thing, of course all bets are off. But the Torah wanted to protect us from ourselves. The Torah knew that there's greed and there's thievery and all of that stuff. So it tried its best to implement all kinds of safeguards within the system itself to ensure that A, that we would be honest, that two, no matter what your circumstances were, you would be able to at least pick yourself up and look in the mirror and feel some kind, even a slave that had to sell himself. Imagine this. What's even worse, I talked about a Jewish and a non-Jewish slave. There's a case of selling your daughter that's underage, an underage daughter. Imagine what you had to do. You have a daughter that's 10 years old and you have to sell her as a maid servant. I mean, how low do you have to go? How poor do you have to be? But if there's nothing else, you turn around. Better than living her and with you living in a refrigerator box. Better than walking the streets and have nothing to do. You sold her. Now, whoever bought her, a 10-year-old or 11-year-old girl, whoever bought her had to treat her with there was so many restrictions into that. What you could make her do, how she had to live then, and this A, B, C, and D. All why? Because the Torah understood that there are certain realities in life that we're going to face. Certain crises that we're going to face. Maybe I'm going to have to sell my house. I need the money for something else. I need a dowry, so I have to sell my house. I need this, I need that. Okay, circumstances happen. Things happen in life. Hashem wanted to give you an opportunity to come back. So even if you bought my home, even if you bought my field, even if you bought something, eventually I still have the opportunity to look myself in the mirror and know that I can make myself whole. And the same is true about all of these things within the economic system. Not to say that it wasn't, not to say that there was no one took advantage. Of course people took advantage, because as soon as you talk about money, there's going to be this idea of greed and of cheating and of lying and of all of these things, because that's part of who we are. But the Torah tried to the best of its ability to put into place safeguards so everybody would be at least trying to play on an even field. All right? Any questions? Okay, I'm going to turn around. Now, are there any questions? This I think we want. Go ahead, Tim.
Those things are the wall city, no smita, or whatever it is.
I beg your pardon? Latzmisus means in perpetuity. Okay. In perpetuity. That means in an unwalled city, you could not buy a house in perpetuity. You had to have a chance, and at Yovel, at the Jubilee year, it went back to its original owner. Go ahead.
Are some of the laws that we have here in the United States taken from
absolutely.
the Torah?
Sure, absolutely. Because it was a system of rules and regulations that went down, throughout the ages. We obviously took it from somebody else. There was, before the Torah, there was also a set of laws that then the Torah refined it and God put it into a divine book, and then it was passed on from the Jews to the Assyrians, from the Assyrians over to the Babylonians passed it on to the Greeks, and everybody made their changes, little bits here and there, and of course it comes down to common law. Now in Israel, since Israel is a secular state, it's a democratic secular state, it's governed more by laws that we understand. You mean, of course, there's no slavery, there's none of the laws of perpetuity coming back to you, all of these things, are null and void anymore. It's pretty much American law. If you buy my house, you bought my house. And have a good day. And unless I could prove fraud on your part, you own my house. That's the way it goes. But certainly, throughout the ages, people and nations and civilizations and cultures and empires took from the Torah these laws. That's why we have what we call today a Judeo-Christian society built upon certain precepts. And
There's actually a lot of similarities because you talked about that 3 years where you can basically, and that's called adverse possession. I think it's 20 years. It might be 10. I don't remember exactly, but you have that. And there is actually, if they foreclose on your house, we still have the right of redemption, right? I think for exactly 1 year.
Sure, you did so. There, absolutely. Thank you very much. There you go. It's
easement by prescription. If I use your land and you let me, then it becomes mine.
Absolutely. That's absolutely true. And that's also true not only for an individual, but that's also true for a public. That means, if all of a sudden, you have a land and you have a field and it's connecting two huge streets, PCH and Second, and we've already established a walkway in there, it's too bad for you. You should have done something before, because once it's established, once there's a chazakah, that's it. You could dance from today to tomorrow, but the public is walking. And that's the way it works. Mark it then, Bob, please.
The safeguards against unfair transactions, does that extend to services too? Like for a doctor, we're not selling you a thing, we're selling you a service.
Oh, sure, absolutely.
How is it valued so you know that it's unfair?
Well, you know what, it's like this. I mean, you went to a doctor, even though doctors were very, very different in Talmudic times when these rules and regulations were really, came together. But let's say, when you went to bloodletting was a huge thing in Talmudic times. Yeah, and the guy let your blood and let too much blood or whatever he did. He didn't do. So then, of course, you can sue. You had recourse in a court to say that whatever you paid, you did nothing for me. And so you had to go through the Beis Din, like we talked about previously, go to a court and prove to the court that, this guy claimed that he was a doctor and that he can, let blood. But when I came to him, all he did was he danced on my back. He didn't do anything, and then he paid me, and I paid him, or whatever it is. So definitely you have recourse in any transaction. There's recourse if you can prove that But since of course contracts were scant because you had to find a guy that can write. How many people knew how to write then? So you had to have a sofer. You had to have actually a scribe. So you got to have a scribe, and it's a whole rigmarole. So you had to be. So if you were smart, you brought witnesses. Or, there was other safeguards you took. But if you didn't, human nature has not changed. And we may have changed technologically. We might have changed maybe in our political outlook. But human nature has not changed since the day that Cain and Abel were on the field, and Cain was unhappy with Abel, and Abel was unhappy with Cain, and they killed each other. We haven't progressed today much in humans. So are there people that are going to try to take advantage of us? Absolutely. What is the old expression? Buyer? Where does that come from? If we're all honest and upfront and doing everything we're supposed to do, why should a buyer beware? Exactly because of that. Because you know what? In the olden days, how they used to sell the coats to the people that were a little less sophisticated. This was an old trick by the coat makers in Eastern Europe. They would put like three coins in the pocket. Okay? So the guy would put on the coat. How does it fit? How does it fit? Didn't fit like this, it was like this, And then the guy would say, no, look, check the pockets. Oh, there's money in the pockets. There's money in the pockets. Okay, sure. So the guy ended up with 3 kopecks, and you overcharged him 500 kopecks. But he thought he got a good deal because he found 3 kopecks in his pocket. Okay? Buyer beware. Buyer beware. Okay? Because there's always going to be those guys that are going to try to get you and fool you and do that to you. What? You think, you put a $20 bill in a guy's pocket, and you don't know, he thinks, woo-hoo, I found $20.
Why could land be sold in perpetuity within a walled city?
A house. Only a house, not land.
Okay.
Not a house, because a walled city was more protected. It was more protected by the wall. An unwalled city was more able to be attacked by its enemies. Therefore, God wanted much less movement around. So you had to think to yourself, okay, you know what? If I sell the house, okay, I can always get it back. This and that. So he wanted more stability in an unwalled city. In a walled city, much less opportunity you could protect yourself. An unwalled city, much more open to elements, undesirable elements. That's why he wanted much less transition and going on in the city and much less movement around. And that's why you couldn't sell that's why you couldn't sell in perpetuity. People would always try to stay within the city itself. And because if you knew you have a house, it's always going to be yours, and so you wouldn't move around. In a walled city, you know what? We'll take our chances. And that was kind of the rationale and the logic behind doing that.
You said that in regard to the Jewish slave that he was required to stay for 6 years, right?
He wasn't required to stay. That was the maximum he could stay. He could stay for 6 years. After 6 years, he was booted out, except under one circumstance, which Tim had brought up before. If the slave said, "Boy, I love my boss. I just love living here. Look at this. I live in Hawaii. It's Honolulu. It's so nice. I work. I don't want to go out." Because a lot of people are afraid of the outside world. They can't make it in the outside world. So I'd rather be under this guy. I'd rather work in this plantation. What do I care? So what they used to do is, and I'll get to your question in a second, Sima. They used to take him to the court, and they drilled a hole in his earlobe. The boss would take like an anvil with a nail, and they would drill a hole here in the ear. Why? Because it says in the Torah, "Vodai, you are my servant. Why are you going and selling yourself to someone else?" So to remind him that God is the ultimate boss, He is the master of the universe, that's why they used to drill a hole, and he could stay until Jubilee year. But once Jubilee year came, they booted him out. He had to go back to his family, away from here. Now, of course, that didn't stop him from coming back after the Jubilee year for another 50 years of servitude. But at least on Jubilee year, everybody went home. Everybody was freed. Everybody left. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Sima. Now your question.
Was there never an exchange of money? I mean, when he left, he left.
Yeah, sure there was exchange of money, because what he would do is, let's say, what happened? Let's take a case here. Mr. A stole from me $1,000. Now he owes me $2,000 because there's kafel. Because every time you make restitution in a theft, you have to pay double. So he owes me $2,000. He doesn't have $2,000. So you go ahead and you buy him. And you say to me, listen, I'm going to work this guy till I get $2,000 worth. You give me the $2,000. He works for you 2 years. Thank you very much. He's gone after 2 years. So you pay me to get him off of his obligation. That's where there's a exchange of money. And once he leaves, you have to also fill him up with, it says hanik tanik, you have to leave him with a gift. I mean, presents and good wishes and etc., etc. So there was exchange of money, but it wasn't to him. It was to me. Or if the guy says to you, listen, I have nothing. I got nothing. I'll work for you and you pay me X amount of dollars, and at the end of the time, here's the money, have a good day, and see you later after 6 years. See you, goodbye. So there was actually an exchange. Or I could come and I say to you, you know what? You bought me for $6,000. Okay? You gave the guy $6,000. I have to work for you for $6,000. Now, good luck to me, my uncle just died. And he left me with $5,000. I could come to you after 1 year because I still owe you $5,000, which you paid for me. Here's $5,000. See you later. That I could do. So I was always able to redeem myself. But if I didn't want to, and a lot of people, I'm not saying a lot of people, but there's a certain type of a person that likes living this kind of a life. Doesn't want the responsibility. Gets up in the morning, does his work, knows that he has 3 meals, knows that he has a bed. What does he care? He needs a 401k. What does he care? He knows you're not going to mistreat him, you're not going to beat him up, you're not going to torture him. He has a bed, he has a place where he could call home, he does his work. To him it makes sense. So what? So what? But after Jubilee year, you had to kick him out. You had to kick him out. Because you got to tell the guy, listen, this is not the way to live. A way to live is Come on, pick yourself up, go out there in the world, make a family, get your own house. Kol mi she'ein lo bayis ein ish. It says anybody who doesn't own a home is not a human being, not a man. Why? Because they expected you to be a man. Get out there, make an acquisition, do something, be productive in society. Just sitting around and working for somebody else, and not working for something else is nothing wrong. Actually, you go home at night. A lot of people work for other people, but servitude. This is the way you live. So that's why they booted him out after the Jubilee year.
What about the master? What rights does he have if the slave refuses to work according to the way it's supposed to be?
Yeah. Well, what he can do is he can go to court and say this was a mekach tos, this was a bad transaction, just like the guy who bought a wrong coat, and he could say, listen, I hired this guy under the rules of slavery. He has to do what I ask him to do, and except with the exceptions I told you, busy work. The guy refuses to do it. I want my money back. And he could probably, he could sue, go find the guy who he gave the money to. He said, I'm sorry, this is no good. And the slave goes free and he gets his money back. The deal is off. He can do that. He has that, that kind of right to do it. But, before you went into this, the rabbis warned you 50 times, before you go into this transaction, think about who you're buying. Who are you buying? You're buying a thief. Now, if you want to bring a thief into your home, you're taking that risk. No one's forcing you to do it, you're taking the risk. Now, or you're taking a risk of a guy that's down and out and has no incentive to go to work. What kind of a person would want to do this? Who would want to do this? Become a slave? But if you're willing to walk around and say, hey, look at me, I got a slave, you're taking the risk. But you know what? If you wanted to, the Torah said, okay, we'll allow it. Of course, only as long as the temple stood. Once there was no more temple, slavery was abolished.
By the same token, the families also sold their children, did they not? As a way of acquiring money for themselves.
Yeah, but that was only good. Minor children they can sell. You cannot sell anybody over bar and bat mitzvah, because then they're adults. So a girl at 12 years old, the father had no rights over her. She was already a woman by all rights and rules and regulations of the Torah. You could only sell her if she was, but who's going to? Not going to sell an 8-year-old. Who's going to buy an 8-year-old? She had a small window of selling. Now, again, you have to think of the master. What's he thinking about over here? So he bought the girl for one purpose. He wanted to marry. He wanted to have her as part of his family. And he would at 12 years old or 13 or 14, whatever it is, they would marry her and do that. He could not resell her. He could not. If you bought a girl, you were so tied up in what you could do with her. I don't know. You were absolutely only doing this for charity's sake, to pay off the father to do something like that. But the Torah allowed it. The Torah allowed. If there was the circumstances was right and you wanted to do this and you knew what you were getting into and no one was forcing you to do this, that's it. You can do it. But it became a huge problem on your part if, as Bob said, the guy didn't want to do it. Okay, so now Yasher Kayach, thank you very much. So now you have to go sue, the regular hassle that you're going to have. But know that beforehand. All right? Okay. Now we know. Now we're on. Next week, we're on for next week. And...